Hey everybody, Attorney Griff O'Hanlon here with Cooper Hurley Injury Lawyers, and I'm here today with my law partner John Cooper, who's just recently written a book, The Traumatic Brain Injury Toolkit, and we've got it right here. And I asked John to sit with me today and chat a little bit about what goes into dealing with traumatic brain injury cases, his experience, and thanks for joining us today, John.
Glad to be here, Griffin. So, traumatic brain injury is a really important part of what's going on in the world of personal injury litigation these days. So there's nothing more timely to talk about. So I'm glad we're here to share a bit with the audience about it.
Yeah, great. And before we even really dive into the meat of our conversation today, I want to let everybody know that you can go to tbitoolkit.com to get your free copy of John's book about traumatic brain injuries with some tips and pointers and general information about traumatic brain injuries and everything that goes into dealing with one personally and then having to go through the legal process. So, John, to get started, why don't you tell our viewers and listeners about what is a traumatic brain injury and what are some of the other names that are used to refer to a traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, that's something that gets confusing for folks because they hear words like concussion or loss of consciousness or traumatic brain injury and aren't entirely sure what those various terms mean. And the short answer, as I know you know, is that every concussion is in fact a traumatic brain injury. A concussion can be relatively simple and may not cause permanent problems, but every time you get concussed, that is in fact damage to your brain and so has to be taken seriously.
And a lot of times those are just defined as mild traumatic brain injuries, is that right?
Right, well, so there's various rules that are used to determine the severity. And so mild is a little misleading. What that really means is when the ambulance gets to you, if you know what day of the week it is, or you know what your name is, and you can respond to a question, then they're going to say you seem to be oriented into space and time and therefore are going to give you a score on a scale that implicates it as mild.
Sure.
If you're sitting there and you can't, you're completely unresponsive, you can't talk, you can barely blink, then they know that it's a extremely serious traumatic brain injury situation. And blessedly, those are obviously less common. Another distinction to make is between a closed head injury and an open head injury. An open head injury means that the skull or scalp has actually been penetrated and there's been a breakage of the skin and possibly a breakage of the bone on the skull, and that's obviously more serious for the medical professionals in assessing it.
Sure, and we've said traumatic brain injury, we've said concussion. A lot of times these are referred to as TBIs. They just use the acronym for a traumatic brain injury. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you hear us talking about TBI or in the book you read TBI, that means traumatic brain injury, which is everything from the mildest of concussions up to the most serious of go to coma.
Sure. And traumatic brain injuries and TBIs, how common is it that you see them after accidents for folks that you're representing?
Well, it's become extremely common these days that there's a recognition of the TBI. In the old days when I began 30 years ago, you might have a headache or something after an accident, and people would treat it as a relatively mild symptom, no big deal. Now, you can have a headache that's caused by a neck injury.
Sure.
It doesn't have to necessarily mean headache is brain injury, but it is certainly one of the major signs and symptoms for brain injury. The numbers, which are in the book in the introductory chapter, which always amaze me every time I see these, there are almost 300,000 TBI-related hospitalizations in the U.S. every year. 56,000 people die from TBIs every year, and 155 people on average die each day. So with that number of accidents, now obviously not all those are car wrecks or slip and falls or the things that we deal with every day, but it just shows you it is a very common problem, and it is one that these are just the numbers that are reported, right? So there's some people going to have it and either not get treated or not report it or the doctor doesn't find it. So these are the confirmed cases. There's a lot of TBIs that are going on out there every day, especially on the road when there's wrecks.
And thank goodness that the science and medical understanding and public awareness of TBIs has improved over the decades, because it's terrifying to think that with those numbers, that they were certainly still happening years ago, and we're just not being treated as they should.
Exactly. And so one of the things that is problematic in our field is that in the emergency room, their main goal is to keep you from dying right there. So if you need a surgery, they're going to get you up to the OR. If it's relatively uncomplicated neck and back strain, then they're going to sort of push you through the system, get you onto an orthopedist or whoever you need to see later, but they're going to get you out of the ER as quickly as they can.
Triage treatment.
Exactly. And so the point is emergency rooms miss about 50%. 50% of the TBIs are missed in the ER. And that's not any fault of the ER doctors. They have a role to play. The other thing that causes a lot of the misdiagnosis or the lack of a diagnosis is that you can do a CAT scan and that can be negative, but a negative CAT scan doesn't mean you don't have a TBI. It mainly means you don't have a big active pool of blood on your brain.
Okay.
So again, there's reasons that ERs miss these. So if for some reason you're at the emergency room and they aren't necessarily talking about the TBI, but you're concerned about it, the trick is to make sure to get in the hands of somebody, your family doctor, or someone who can deal with that in the days right after a wreck, so that you make sure that it gets diagnosed. One thing that's worth noting, Griffin, as I know you know, is that some of it is a cascade of chemical effects that aren't present right there immediately at the scene. And it takes a while for all the bad things that happen with the tissue damage, the swelling, and the lack of connection between the neurons, so that at that point you really end up in day 2 and 3, you can have symptoms that weren't there in the emergency room as well.
And that segues nicely, John, into my next question. You said that in the ER, it's keeping you alive, making sure you don't die, looking for that massive brain bleed or something along those lines, but that there's a developing nature of TBI symptoms as times pass. What should folks who are concerned after having been in an accident keep an eye out for, or should family members keep an eye out for signs and symptoms that there might be something that needs to be addressed?
That's a great question, Griffin. And in the book, by the way, we give you a lot of the signs and symptoms so you can look for them. But the gist of it is pain around the face. So that could be headache, it could be jaw pain, it could be broken bones in the face, cuts, anything that basically is in the head or neck area that is hurting. The next level of symptoms are thinking and processing kinds of things, cognitive things. So that can be memory problems or trouble making decisions, very commonly trouble finding words. And so a family member may see that and recognize it in a way that the person who suffered the injury may not even realize that they're talking funny or they're repeating themselves or something else is going wrong.
So you get feedback from family members, coworkers, things like that?
Exactly. So, for instance, I'm reminded of a case as we're preparing to meet with you today, where a young man is hit in a head-on collision in Virginia Beach. And as a result of that collision, he gets out of his car and he's actually speaking gibberish. I mean, he's kind of talking in a way that makes no sense, some repetition, and just not being responsive to the questions. He gets on the phone with his loved ones who come to the scene, and they observe this kind of altered speech pattern where he just isn't making sense. So what you're going to typically see at the scene is being dazed or confused, maybe speaking in a funny way, or having a hard time answering questions. So those are some of the early things, is those cognitive memory things. Right at the scene, there's typically going to be, if not loss of consciousness, which means you're blacked out, there's going to be some indication of altered consciousness. Another very common version of that is memory problems like retrograde amnesia, which is sort of a fancy lawyer word or medical word for basically not remembering what just happened in the accident. Very common that they remember the moment of impact and then they have sort of a gap from there until some point in the treatment. Sometimes I didn't realize what happened until I got to the hospital, or I had a blackout, and by the way, it's different between blacking out where you're just totally unconscious, which can be just seconds, and you may not even know that you're unconscious, compared to these other symptoms, which is once you come out of unconsciousness or you're talking to folks, you're having trouble remembering what just happened because it was such a jolt to your brain.
And we do these a lot in our firm, but as I hear you talking about, what someone goes through right after a crash, it's really terrifying that you can be experiencing these symptoms and not be aware of it yourself, and the importance of relying on your family and being monitored after a crash if you think you've suffered any sort of head trauma. It's really a terrifying thing.
Yeah, it's really important. And one of the things about, as we talk a little bit more about sort of proving these cases, the ER people, the ambulance people are going to say, did you lose consciousness? Now, the fact is, if I lost consciousness, I don't necessarily know that I lost consciousness, particularly if it was just seconds. So asking me, often what we see in the chart is unknown, that they just can't say one way or the other. Sometimes we are lucky enough as the lawyers to have a passenger sitting there, and then they can observe that the person was blacked out or unconscious in the first seconds afterwards. Or we have a bystander, or possibly even the ER people or the EMS people get there right away, and that those symptoms of dazed, disoriented, confused are still present by the time they get there.
Given this uniqueness of the types of symptoms and issues that folks have after suffering a traumatic brain injury, right? I mean, if you're in a car crash and you suffer whiplash or even a broken bone, right? There's very clear treatment for those things. It's go to an orthopedist, do some physical therapy, ice it, rest.
X-rays and MRIs.
Pretty straightforward stuff that I'm sure you've been dealing with for 30 years in helping folks out. What's unique about the treatment and how someone experiences a traumatic brain injury after a crash?
Right. So typically in a major crash event where there are broken bones and these other things, the emergency room is going to triage those first and figure out whether you need to have a surgery or something like that. And so sometimes they're not really talking to you about your headache and your memory issues because they're bigger fish to fry at that moment. And then over the course of time, it develops. The main thing is to go to a trusted healthcare provider, including like your family doctor, who knows you well, and they can tell the difference between how you're there 2 days after this wreck compared to how you have been for the past 5 years. Some of us aren't so lucky as to have an old family doctor that we trust like that.
Or health insurance, for that matter.
Or that's true too. And so one of the things that we as personal injury lawyers can do is, for those who don't have health insurance, we can guide you to some folks who will help treat you and make sure we know what's wrong with you, mainly for your health, but also so we can document it for purposes of the case. But the chain of treatment after emergency room is typically going to be a family doctor or someone like that, maybe a local neurologist, because neurologists deal with headaches and some of the complex of symptoms. And then ultimately, we often recommend people see a neuropsychiatrist.
What's that?
Yeah. So neuropsychiatry is a person who's specialized in both neurology and also in psychiatry. And there's a lot of overlap between those two. A lot of the deficits and problems that come out of post-concussive syndrome or mild TBI are of the sort that basically overlap between psychological things like irritability and depression and more physiological, neurological things. And so these are doctors who are specialized in TBI medicine, which is a new certificate. It didn't used to be that before the old days, we didn't have that. There now is a specialty for traumatic brain injury medicine. And there's only a few people in the state of Virginia who actually have these certifications. And of course, we know those doctors well and work with them often.
And those neuropsychs are medical doctors?
Absolutely. And very specialized medical doctors who have, again, not only the medical degree, but also the specialization in the neurocognitive field, which is the injury of TBI.
And in watching you handle these cases and chatting with you about them over the years, I've seen that the uniqueness of the injuries and symptoms that people are dealing with lead to a unique litigation process that's different than really moving forward and putting an injury case into court and suit and having to go through depositions. What is unique about actually litigating a TBI case?
Yeah, well, so the hardest part about litigating TBI is the fact that it's an invisible injury. We often talk about this. These folks, whether it's somebody coming back from a foreign deployment in a war, or a person who gets injured playing sports, or a person who gets hurt in a car wreck, they're going to have a whole separate, a separate set of issues beyond what else is wrong with them, and they are not visible to the naked eye. So you could have a TBI. I could sit here and look at you, and to look at you, you would look perfectly normal. You look the same as you do now because it's all obviously inside the brain, and so there's no way to just look at you and say, oh yeah, that guy's got a TBI. And even by talking to you, it's not necessarily clear whether you're a person who suffered a TBI or not. And the reason is you start wherever you came from. And so if you were already an attorney, for instance, you might have enough resources mentally and hopefully physically that you can kind of hide your TBI. And so the other thing is that TBI symptoms do overlap with other kinds of problems. So if you're acting irritable and depressed and angry, there can be lots of reasons to be irritable, depressed, and angry. I'm often that way, and I haven't yet suffered a TBI. Having said that, it is looking at the whole person that the family and the doctors are in the best position to say, yes, not only did you suffer a TBI, but you have lingering symptoms from it.
Right. So a lot of times you don't have image study like an X-ray that could say, look, here's the broken arm, here's the broken leg. You really have to rely on the family members to say, this is how I remembered Johnny before, and this is how Johnny is now.
Right. That's exactly right. And so putting it together involves a lot of contact with the family and understanding, how the person's life has changed, both daily living activities, work activities, relationships really suffer when people have a TBI. It's very hard to live with somebody who has a TBI, and you love them, but they're acting in this way that they didn't used to act, and it can be very emotionally draining for the family. So the lay people, the lay witnesses are very, very important. On the medical side, you've got to have these very expert doctors that know how to look for it and test it and make suggestions to treat it. The other side will have 10 guys from Harvard. The insurance company has unlimited resources, so they're going to hire a bunch of people who'll say, oh, no, it came from something else, or no, it's not that bad, or the best they usually will say is, oh, maybe they have post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not really a TBI. And again, they'll say that in every case, and then you have this huge battle of the experts, which is quite costly. Now, our firm, if we're taking your case, will pay for those experts to do all that forensic work, that law work they have to do. But it does get expensive, and the insurance companies fight like heck on these. And so they will pull out all the stops. Now, there aren't that many good radiological images that are available. There are a couple of exceptions. One of them is a special MRI done at a certain level of intensity that can be read by a computer. And there's a relatively new technology called NeuroQuant, which anybody who's in this field has heard of. And it's an accepted technology that looks with a computer at an MRI taken in a certain way, and it will show that some organs or some parts of the brain may have shrunk, or they may have become enlarged. But they compare it to what would be expected for your age group, and look at those changes. And then often it can actually correlate back to specific problems. If you have a frontal lobe problem in the front of the brain, that may affect your ability to make decisions or to be able to do planning. And so you can see a lesion or a problem on that NeuroQuant, and then the doctor can clinically match it back up to some of what's going on with you. And although it is not a one-for-one diagnostic, it's strongly corroborative. And the images that come out of it are interesting because you can actually pinpoint on the brain, hey, that's not normal. And then the doctors fight about, how did it get there and what does it mean?
Sure. So think of it like an X-ray of the brain. It's much more involved and there's much more going on, but it can serve as something that you can point to and say, look right here.
Exactly. And that's important for the jury or the insurance companies to accept and understand the injury.
Certainly, the work that you do with folks who've suffered traumatic brain injuries is a tremendous resource and asset to the family and the hurt individual, and I commend you on everything that you've done for these folks. Are there other resources beyond the legal help for folks who've suffered traumatic brain injuries that can help them maybe not get back to where they were before, but to live a normal, healthy, well-adjusted life despite their symptoms?
Yeah, that's really important. The support for families, of course, it's never enough, but there are some resources that are available. One source that we often send folks to is the BIAV, the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. And they're a tremendous organization which does various things. They run summer camps for young people. They help you find like groups of support groups where you can talk about it, both family groups and for the sufferers themselves. And so there's better resources now than there used to be. And part of our job as personal injury lawyers is to kind of direct you to those resources so that you get all the help that you can get. And ultimately, the purpose of personal injury litigation involving TBI is to try to get resources to the family to be able to provide all of the care that's needed. So if you have a long-term TBI issue, you're going to need some care to help you just do things around your house so you don't burn down the house or end up somehow hurting yourself or others because you aren't able to function as you were before the wreck.
And I've always thought of TBI as kind of, it's an odd analogy, but like snowflakes, right? No TBI is the same. Mm-hmm. Everybody experiences a TBI differently. Mm-hmm. And understanding that, but what is the long-term prognosis for folks who've suffered TBIs? Do they generally expect improvement? And we understand, with severe TBIs, no improvement may be expected, but do most folks improve over time with treatment or assistance?
Yeah. So, again, as you rightly pointed out, this is not for somebody who's in a coma or has had their head bashed in or, a bullet's gone in their brain or something. Those are obviously different situations which are more clearly major long-term problems. But even in the nature of concussion and mild TBI, most people actually do recover after about 6 months. So there's a period of weeks and months of healing, and that does happen for many, many people, and that's a blessing that that's how it is.
It is.
But there's a significant percentage, some of the literature used to say 15%, and it's probably unclear exactly what the exact percentage is, but some significant percentage will have symptoms beyond a year. And so if you're having TBI symptoms that last more than a year, and certainly more than 2 years, at that point, you are probably not going to have any more spontaneous recovery. And what you have to do is learn adaptive behaviors, how to write lists for yourself, or have other people help you basically with the organization of your day and your life so that you don't forget to take your medication, that you do show up to the doctor appointments, and that you're able to function as best you can going back to your old life, but with adjustments. And some of these can be can be damaging, and you can lose your career over this. Again, the young man I was talking about before in Virginia Beach, he had wanted to become a truck driver and had moved towards that by taking classes and trying to get a CDL. And you certainly don't want to be on the road as a truck driver if you have blinding headaches and you can't remember what you should be able to remember.
Last thing you'd want to be is a danger to other folks on the road when you've been affected by that.
Exactly. And so that's an example where even symptoms like headache and forgetfulness or difficulty making decisions, even if they're not completely impaired, but they're just somewhat impaired, that could make you a danger, particularly as a professional truck driver. So that young man lost his career choice because of that. So those are some of the long-term aspects. And then, of course, that affects his girlfriend or his fiance and his mom and everybody else in his life because, he's gotten derailed by this injury.
And, we've been talking now for 15 or 20 minutes about TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, concussions, and covered a lot of material. That alone is almost enough of an explanation as why you need a lawyer to help you out with these cases. But you also mentioned the fact that insurance companies fight like heck on any sort of invisible injury type thing. Can you explain a little bit about how important with a TBI it is to have a lawyer assisting you with any sort of claim that you make?
Yeah. So, I mean, insurance companies are in the business of taking in premium dollars and paying out as little as they can get away with paying out. And by the way, that's not just the other guy's insurance company, that's your insurance company. Does the same thing to you if you're adverse to them, which in automobile litigation, as you know, under insured motorist or whatever, you may be fighting your own company. So, first of all, I would never go into any significant automobile injury litigation or personal injury litigation without a lawyer. It's like trying to do your own plumbing. Yeah, you might get it right, but you might have a huge disaster and make it worse. So call the expert.
Exactly.
But that's especially true, as you noted, for TBI, because there's a lot of special tricks of the trade, quite frankly, that we know what we're looking for and how to put together a case. And we can help you to make sure that you get the treatment you need and that we have the right documentation on the case so that the insurance company can't try to pick it apart later and say, well, if it had been so bad, he would have done this or he would have done that. Plus, the insurance companies love to play on the myths. There's a lot of myths about TBI. Like one of them is that you have to have suffered a loss of consciousness. That's not true. You can have no loss of consciousness, but that dazed, confused, disoriented, retrograde amnesia type of symptom, and that's still a diagnosable concussion. Likewise, and this is a little surprising, it's counterintuitive, you don't actually have to have hit your head. So sometimes we see that they bang their head on the headrest or they whack the window or the airbag or the lack of an airbag has caused some contact with the front of their head. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have to be that. In fact, you can have just an incredibly hard shaking, which is not unlike a whiplash injury, where your head whips forward and back. And if that happens with enough speed and velocity, you can have brain damage without having a direct blow to the brain. And again, insurance companies will pretend that they don't know that or that that's not true, but the literature is very clear on it. Part of the anatomy, and this is to me, it's fascinating. The brain is like jello or gelatin inside a box, and the skull is like the box. But it's not only a hard box, it's a box with nails or spikes coming out of it because you have these ridges along your skull. And so if you take jello in a box and you shake it real hard, it's going to bust up the jello, right? And that's essentially what happens, but it actually is happening at a cellular or microscopic level. And then it has this cascade of effects of bleeding and swelling and a loss of connection between the neurons and the tissues. And then the brain tries to react to heal itself, and then that causes other problems. And so understanding the anatomy of it and some of the myths is really important. And so you need somebody, not just a personal injury lawyer, but one who's done TBI litigation.
And you jumped right on what I was going to say there, the experience needed in your lawyer, because you can make the claim, you can start filing a lawsuit, you can take depositions, you can talk to the doctors. But at the end of the day, if you can't explain this science and what happens to the brain to jury members who have no experience with it, then it's all for naught. I mean, you have to be able to explain these things to folks who have no experience dealing with TBI. So it goes without saying then that experience is a needed trait for your lawyer.
It does matter. And learning how to work with the doctors, what are the issues that you're looking for, what is the insurance company going to say, and the hired gun doctors that they bring in, and being able to rebut that. So no question, the reason you hire a personal injury lawyer in any case is let us worry about the medicine and the insurance and the legalities, and you can focus on getting better and taking care of your family and doing the things that you need to do to get well. And then hopefully, if we've done our job well and everything works out, we've created some resources for you to be able to cope with this for the rest of your life.
And one of those resources, again, is the book that John wrote, The Traumatic Brain Injury Toolkit, which, again, you can get at tbitoolkit.com.
Totally free, right?
Totally free with a lot of the information we've covered here today, along with additional information. John, we've spoken about the hardships people have and go through following a traumatic brain injury and through the litigation process. But when we let everyone go, Tell me about a success story that you've had with somebody who's suffered a traumatic brain injury but has come out on the other side and been understanding of the process and has moved on and really thrived afterwards.
Yeah. There's so many examples of some very brave clients that we've had over the years. And, I think about a person I represented who was a single mom, raising teenage boys, holding down a job in the real estate world. And, she didn't have any choice but to get back to work.
Right.
But it bothered her because she loved her profession, how good she was at it, that she had lost some of her ability to do her job, both in terms of communication skills, in terms of organization, in terms of fatigue. By the way, that's really another huge part of the problem is it will typically mess up your sleep and cause insomnia, and then that all just feeds on itself. But anyway, so she's one person I think of fondly because she was such a brave person. She kept it together. She kept her family intact, kept her job as best she could, and just was coping with it. And hopefully we helped her to learn about the injury, to get the treatment she needed, and to give her some resources to get back on her feet.
Yeah, and so if there's anyone who's watching, who's dealing with these sorts of issues, there is hope. There can be a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a battle. There's no doubt it's a battle, but it's certainly worth putting in the effort. And with the right help and the right resources, you can come out on the other side and continue to be you. There's no doubt about it.
And if you don't know much about personal injury law, and hopefully you haven't had to hire an attorney before, the way we work is on a contingency fee basis, which means a percentage basis. You don't owe us a penny for our time unless and until we get a result for you. So there's no downside. If you have a question about a TBI that was somebody else's fault, you should call me or Griffin, and we will be happy to talk to you and try to point you in the right direction. And the sooner you make that call, the better. We'll be able to do more the earlier you let us know what's going on with you. So please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, and again, John, I think it's a great resource, the Traumatic Brain Injury Toolkit book that you wrote, and TBItoolkit.com or CooperHurley.com. You can get your free copy of the book. So, John, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me about brain injuries.
You're welcome, Griffin. Thank you, too.
And your experience. And I want to thank everyone who is watching today. So, again, Griffin O'Hanlon with Cooper Hurley Injury Lawyers and my law partner, John Cooper. We thank you.
Have a good day.